Hi guys, it's been a while since we've done a video lesson. So your homework tonight is video lesson 2.4. I'd like you to write down what I'm writing as I work through the notes. And we're going to talk about properties. 4 new ones. I know you're used to the associative property and the commutative property and the distributive property. We've talked about those all year. And today we're going to introduce 4 new ones. And they're pretty easy to understand, mostly because you've been using them ever since we started Unit 2 when you solve equations. The first one is the addition property of equality, which basically tells you that if a number or an expression is equal to another number or expression, then adding the same thing to each side will not change the value of each side. So if x equals a, then x plus a, or excuse me, if x equals y, then x plus a will equal y plus a. And we're going to let you abbreviate it with the APE. You can use that abbreviation as long as you know what it stands for, addition property of equality. We use this when we add something to both sides of an equation in order to get that x by itself. The multiplication property of equality is similar. If x equals y, then multiplying both sides by the same number a, for example, will be equivalent and balanced as well. If you multiply x times a, you multiply y times a, you end up with a nice balanced equation. And we'll use this abbreviation, MPE, for the multiplication property of equality. The subtraction property of equality, you could probably write it down yourself. If x equals y, then x minus a is going to equal y minus a. If you subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation, the equation remains balanced. And we'll call this SPE, the subtraction property of equality. And lastly, the division property of equality. If x equals y, then you can divide x by a, and you can divide y by a, and the equation will remain balanced. We'll call that DPE, the division property of equality. You use that pretty much typically in the last step of solving an equation, when you divide both sides by something to get to your value of x. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. Not only are we going to state the property needed to solve the equation, but then we're going to solve each equation. If you look at number 1, we have to get x by itself, and to do that we would subtract 3 from both sides. So since we subtracted something from both sides, we use the subtraction property of equality, and 8 minus 3 gives you an x value of 5. For number 2, that almost looks like a proportion in number 2. We can turn it into a proportion by putting the 2 over 1, because 2 over 1 is equivalent to 2. And we've practiced this already. When we have a proportion, we cross multiply to solve it. And so we've just used the multiplication property of equality. And when we do that, x times 1 gives you x, and 6 times 2 gives you 12. In number 3, in order to solve this equation, you'd have to divide both sides by 5. That's the division property of equality. And when you divide 10 by 5, you get x equals 2. For number 4, to get x by itself, you'd have to add 3 to both sides. Since you added something to both sides, it's the addition property of equality. And the value for x is 7, because 4 plus 3 is 7. Now number 5 is a little different, because our 4 new properties, these properties of equality, they really only happen when you do the same thing to both sides of an equation. But to simplify this, we wouldn't have to do something to both sides. We would just have to combine like terms on one side of the equation. 3x minus 2x is 1x. We end up with 1x equals 8. So this is one of the other properties that we've already learned. We just use the associative property of addition because we regrouped. First 3 was times x, and we were subtracting 2 times x. We combined them. Now it's just 1 times x. And lastly, to get the x by itself here, you would have to get the x to one side by subtracting 3x from both sides. Since you subtracted something from both sides, you have used the subtraction property of equality. 4x minus 3x gives me 1x, and you're left with 1x equals 2. So let's try and name the property, and maybe it's one of our old ones, maybe it's one of our new ones that we talked about today. Let's talk about what property do we use to get from one step in this equation to the next. Well, if I look at these first 2 steps, the right side and the right side, they look the same. It's the left side that looks a little different. We got rid of the parentheses, and to do that, we multiplied x times 1, which gave us x, and we multiplied x times negative x, which gave us negative x squared. We use the distributive property. Now to get from here to here, let's see how it's changed. It looks like the left side, the order used to be x, negative x squared, 2x, and then negative 4. But now it's x, 2x, and negative 4. Where did the x squared go? Well, you'll notice the x squared from this side disappeared as well. So I'm thinking what we did to make that happen is we added x squared to both sides. And since we added something to both sides, we used the addition property of equality. And the reason the x squareds disappeared is because negative x squared plus x squared is 0. Negative x squared plus x squared is 0. Alright, now from here to here, it looks like we combined these like terms on the left side. We didn't do something to both sides of the equation. We simply combined like terms, which is always the associative property of addition. I know you're used to that involving parentheses. It doesn't always. When you're combining like terms on one side of the equation, you're using the associative property of addition. From here to here, 3x minus 4 equals 8x minus 24 became 3x plus 20 equals 8x. The negative 24 is no longer on this side of the equation, so my guess is we added it to both sides. And negative 4 plus 24 is the same as 24 minus 4. That's how we ended up with 3x plus 20 on this side. And these canceled. We were left with 8x on the right side. We added something to both sides so that we used the addition property of equality. Now to turn 3x plus 20 equals 8x into 20 equals 5x, you would have to subtract 3x from both sides. We use the subtraction property of equality to do that. We ended up with 20 equals 5x because 8x minus 3x is 5x. And to come up with our solution, we would have to divide both sides by 5. We end up with x equals 4. And the last step was the division property of equality. Now exercise 3 is a little different because I'm not going to give you all the steps. We're going to number the steps, and we're also going to number the properties we use that go along with each step. So if you take a look at this big mess, the first thing I bet you'll want to do is multiply this negative 3 through the parentheses to get rid of those parentheses. So in step 1, we're going to end up with 7x minus, in parentheses, we now have 4x minus 3x plus 3 equals x plus 12. To get rid of those parentheses, I distributed. So property number 1 is distributive property. Continuing to work inside those parentheses, I would combine these like terms. 4x minus 3x is 1x. We end up with 7x minus, in parentheses, we have 1x plus 3 equals x plus 12. And as I said just a minute ago, whenever you combine like terms, you are using the associative property of addition. Now remember, when you have a negative in front of the parentheses, it's like having a negative 1 in front of those parentheses. So we're actually going to distribute again and get 7x minus 1x minus 3 equals x plus 12. For step 3, we used, again, the distributive property. Negative 1 times 1x is negative 1x. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. For step 4, you have some more like terms to combine. 7x minus 1x is 6x. You end up with 6x minus 3 equals x plus 12. You combined like terms, so step 4 is the associative property of addition. Now in step 5, you have to get the x to one side. So I'm going to do minus 1x to both sides. And that's going to leave me with 6x minus 1x, which is 5x, minus 3. These cancel out. You're left with equals 12. We did use one of our properties of equality that time. We subtracted something from both sides, so we use the subtraction property of equality. Now to further isolate that variable x, we have to add 3 to both sides. So we end up with 5x equals 12 plus 3 is 15. Since we added something from to both sides, we have used the addition property of equality. The last step would be to divide both sides by 5. You'd end up with x equals 15 divided by 5, or 3. We divided both sides by something, so we used the division property of equality. So tomorrow in class, come in, get your notes out. Let me see that you have them done. And we will practice these skills and hop right into lesson 2.5. I will see you next class.